Hi class, over the weekend you should have watched the 7-6 day 2 longer video that Ms. Green made introducing how to find an equation for a sine and cosine function. And in this video I'll just do the warm-up we would have done as though I was in class to review that concept. When we finish this warm-up, which is your attendance for today, so make sure you watch this video until the very end, then you should go to your Pearson practice and complete your 7-6 day 2 Pearson practice. Before we do our example, and we're only doing one graph, and we're going to write both the sine and cosine function for it, I want to start by just reviewing some of the key things that you need to remember when you are writing an equation. First of all, the equation is y equals a, and then it's either going to be sine or cosine. So I put sine slash cosine, but you'll pick one of those. And then remember the b is there, but you have to factor the b out. So it'll be b parenthesis x minus h plus k. Okay, so we've been seeing that x minus h plus k all year long. It doesn't really change how it works. We just now have to be able to write the equation with it. The other thing that's important to remember is what the original sine and cosine look like. Remember that the sine of x, that's the one that starts at 0, 0. Okay, so it's going to go up, down, and end here. And y equals cosine of x, that's the one that starts at its maximum point. So it starts up at 1, down, up, and over. Okay, so max and mins of 1. These are the key things that we need to know. So the amplitude of the original is 1, and don't forget the period of both originally are 2 pi. Because in order to find the adjusted graphs, we need to make sure that we know what they start as. Now, in your homework, a lot of times it will tell you which function to use. So if I'm being told to use the sine function, then for me to figure out what's happened, I'm going to look for the first point where it crosses the x-axis, so the first 0, because it could shift left or right. Or the midline, I should say. Actually, it's wherever it crosses the midline, because if it's shifted up or down, it won't actually cross 0, or it might not. If I'm asked to use a cosine curve, then you are looking for the first time that it has a maximum, because that's how we think about the cosine starting. Okay, so when we go to write these, we need to understand that this is the form, and then the A is the amplitude. And we've been talking about that already this chapter, but remember that's the height from the midline. So you're going to see how high it goes up from the midline, and you'll throw that in front. Then you'll put either sine or cosine, either based on what they tell you to use, or if you get to pick, you pick the one that you want. The next thing you have to figure out is the b. Now remember, if you have a phase shift left and right, b has to go outside of a parentheses. B, though, has to do with period. So this changes if the period is not 2 pi. So if when you look at your graph, the period is 2 pi, you don't need to put anything in for b. It's just 1, so you just leave it. Now, if it gives you a different period, so a lot of the graphs we look at actually have a period of 2 pi, but there's one problem at least in your homework where the period is not 2 pi. So if the period is not 2 pi, then you're going to use that 2 pi over b equals the period. And you're going to solve for b. So for example, if I have a graph where the period is actually 10, then I would take 2 pi over b, set it equal to the period of 10, and then I solve for b. So I would multiply both sides by b. I get 2 pi equals 10b, and then I would divide by 10. I would always simplify. 2 over 10 is the same as pi over 5 equals b. Okay, so in this case, if 10 is my period, I would put in a pi over 5 for the b in front of the parentheses of the x. Okay, so that's probably the trickiest one to do. But again, most of the graphs you're going to get will have a period of 2 pi, but if it doesn't, you do have to go through that work. All right, the h and the k are no different than what we've done before. H is the horizontal shift. In these graphs, they do call it the phase shift, so there will be questions where it just says, what is the phase shift? And again, what I'd be looking for in the sine curve is if it has a point at 0, like wherever its middle point is, the first one, let's say this was pi over 2 to the right, then I would say the phase shift is a plus pi over 2. The way that Pearson works when they have you type in just what the phase shift is, though, so like if it just asks the phase shift, if it's a negative phase shift, so if it shifts to the left, you would just type it in as a negative, like pi over 2. However, remember when you put it into the equation, because it's an x minus h, that's the setup. Remember how we keep saying that if you actually go left pi over 2, it would be an x plus pi over 2 in the equation. And that's really because you're doing x minus negative pi over 2. Okay, so remember with the phase shift, when it goes into the equation, it's the opposite of what you think. If it just asks for the phase shift, though, or when it just asks for your phase shift, you would actually keep it as the sign that you would use. All right, and last but not least, K is the vertical shift. So for that one, I would be looking at the midline. So look at midline, where that moved to. Okay, wherever the midline moved to, that's your vertical shift, and that one's always the same as what we think. So if I see that it shifted up 3, I'd put a plus 3 on the end. Okay, so these rules are really no different than what we've been talking about. The A is the vertical stretch or shrink, so that's why it's the amplitude, goes in front. The H and K we've been using. B is really the new one, and so we'll want to make sure we practice that. Having said that, I practiced it down here. It doesn't come up in this example. Okay, so to finish up, let's look at an example. So we have this curve, and it wants us to find both a sine and cosine function, which is good for us to see because it's important to know that we understand that you could take the same graph and always write either a sine or cosine. So that's where you have to make sure you read what they're asking for, and if they don't say, then you pick. Okay, so the first thing I always want to find is the period. Okay, so I pick either a high point to a high point, or a low point to a low point, or a midpoint to a midpoint. Okay, so I'm going to actually use this point. It looks like they give me the ordered pairs at negative pi over 4. So these are counting by pi over 4s, so every chunk. So this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is 7 pi over 4, comma 5, because that's how high it goes. So from this high point to this high point, I went a negative pi over 4 plus a 7 pi over 4. That's 8 pi over 4. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. That's 7 pi over 4 plus another pi over 4. So that's 8 pi over 4, which 8 pi over 4 is the same as 2 pi. So my period is in fact 2 pi, which means that I don't have to do anything for B. Okay, so that's why I practiced that below. Now next I'm going to figure out my amplitude. Well, amplitude is the height from the midline. So I'm going to draw my midline. My midline looks like it's right here. Midline is at y equals 4. And that's going to become important in the future. So if that's my midline and the highest point is at 5, that means my amplitude is actually only 1 as well. Now, the last things I'm going to need to figure out is the shift up and down and left and right. Well, the left and right, though, is dependent on the sine and cosine function, which one I'm using. So I'm going to wait until we're talking about those specifically. Having said that, I can do my vertical shift for all of these. Because remember, the midline started at 0, 0, and it shifted up to 4. So the vertical shift for both sine and cosine would be up 4. Okay, so in your Pearson homework, you will have to fill in blanks. They'll ask you, what is the period, what is the amplitude, what is the vertical shift, and it will also ask the phase shift, but we'll answer those underneath sine and cosine. Okay, so let's start with the sine function. Okay, so if I'm writing the sine function, I'm going to write y equals a times the sine of b times x minus h plus k. That's what I'm looking for. I've already dealt with a, that's my amplitude, that's just going to be 1. Okay, so we can highlight here, a is going to be 1. B, we said the period is 2 pi, which means as soon as the period is 2 pi, that means my b is also just 1. So I don't need to worry about it. The k is the vertical shift that we've already found. So we said it went up 4, that's going to be the k. So the only thing we need to figure out is the h. And again, that's the phase shift. So the last question before you'd write your equation that Pearson would ask would be for the phase shift. Now, for the sine function, I am looking for a place where it crosses the midline. Okay, and then goes up from there, actually. That would be important. So I'm going to use this point. It's the first point where it starts on the midline and goes in the positive direction. I could use this point, but then I would have to use a negative sine curve. That would still be correct. Or I could, in theory, use this one back here if I wanted to use the negative. Okay, so either one of these, any one of these three would be okay. You could get the right answer. Your equation would just be slightly different. But I'm going to use the one that's highlighted in purple. And so if that point was usually starting at 0, and it now starts at 5 pi over 4, that means it's a phase shift of 5 pi over 4 to the right. But again, in Pearson, they just want you to put 5 pi over 4. Unless it gives you a drop-down menu or asks left or right, it's actually just looking for the positive 5 pi over 4. All right, so for my answer, I would fill in A is just 1. I don't need to put it, but I could. Sine of B is 1, so I don't need to worry about that. Now, if it goes right pi over 4, inside parentheses, I need it to be the opposite of what I think. So x minus 5 pi over 4 actually says that this goes right 5 pi over 4. And finally, plus 4. All right, so that's that one. Now I want you to try the cosine function. Okay, so it's very similar, but you have to have a different starting point. So pause the video, see what you come up with, and then check it. All right, so you should have gotten your A, B, and K to be the same. A and B are 1, K is still plus 4. The only thing that's different is the phase shift. So for this one, I need to find another point, but this time I'm looking for a high point. Okay, so I have two choices. I can either use this one, or in theory, I could have used this high point over here. If you use the blue one over here, then you would have had right 7 pi over 4, and that would be totally fine. I just want to show you an example of a phase shift to the left. Okay, so if this is the one that I'm using, I would say the phase shift. In words, I would say it is left pi over 4. Okay? In Pearson, though, sometimes it doesn't ask for the direction. So if it doesn't ask for the direction, if it just wants you to type it in the box, you would actually just type in negative pi over 4. Okay? The period, the amplitude, the vertical shift, those would all be the same. When you go to write your equation, the A is 1, cosine, B is 1, x. Now, if I want to go left pi over 4, this is where I shift the sign. So to go left pi over 4, I would actually do a plus pi over 4, and then plus 4 on the end. Okay, so that's from one graph being able to write both the sine and cosine. And you can see that if I graphed both those in my calculator, they would actually be the exact same graph. Now, again, there are a few where your amplitude is not 1, so make sure you're always checking for that. And there's, I think, just one example where the B is not 1 as well. So we talked about that at the bottom. All right, if you didn't watch the original video, though, it does show a lot more of the different amplitudes and different B values, so you'd want to make sure you watch that as well. But now that you have completed the warm-up video, you should either go back and watch the original video or try to get your 7-6 Day 2 Pearson practice completed. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.